Hidden inside the hollow shell of my late husband's antique copy of Wuthering Heights, I found the original partnership agreement my daughter swore under penalty of perjury she had never seen. 3 years later, she stands in my bed and breakfast wearing a housekeeping dress I designed, navy blue with "Pressed Out My Trust," embroidered over the heart in thread the exact shade of the turret's stained glass, and every guest receipt prints the docket number of her felony conviction. This is the procedural anatomy of how I dismantled her forged quitclaim deed, voided an $830,000 cash sale, and turned the Victorian she tried to steal into the turret of Betrayal bed and breakfast. I am 54 years old, a retired ICU nurse who spent 22 years reading a patient's deteriorating cardiac output from the pallor of their nail beds, and the faint sweat at the temple. My husband Martin had been a quiet architect who drafted his own bookshelves on vellum, scaled to the inch, and spent every Saturday of our marriage cutting oak and cherry with a dovetail jig he kept oiled like a surgical instrument. When his aorta dissected at 49, no warning, no family history, he left me a life insurance payout of $125,000. Not a fortune, but exactly enough to buy a crumbling 1890s turreted house on Linden Street for $42,000 at a tax sale and pour the rest into restoring every original wainscot, sash and slate tile. I remember mixing the linseed oil putty on the front porch, the smell of boiled linseed and whiting powder, and pressing it into the transom frames with a flexible putty knife until the glass sang when tapped. Martin's collection of first edition Brontes and Dickens, over 300 volumes, already had their designated shelves in the 12-sided turret room, where the morning light through the stained glass panels threw emerald and amber lozenges across the leather spines. Our daughter Lauren had just earned her notary commission through Morrison Title and Escrow, where she worked as a paralegal. She was 29 then, quick with a stamp and hungry for permanence. We drew up a partnership agreement at the kitchen table, 50% ownership to me, 50% to her, financed entirely from my inheritance, with a recorded covenant granting me lifetime exclusive possession of the turret bedroom and Martin's entire library. The covenant stated that my right to occupy the turret was irrevocable, a life estate measured against the house itself, and that any disturbance of that right would cause the property to revert in full to me. Lauren notarized the document herself, the raised seal biding clean into the paper with the crisp embossment of her active commission number and expiration date, and filed it with the county recorder the same afternoon, stamping the top of the form with the little red, recorded ink, exactly where the deputy clerk would later initial. I spent 4 years inside that house, rebuilding it with the same hands that once intubated crashing patients. I taught myself to steam bend wainscoting using a wallpaper steamer and a jig of galvanized pipe, to reglaze the transom windows with a putty knife and linseed compound, work to the consistency of warm dough, to fish old knob and tube wiring through plaster walls using a fiberglass snake and a spool of mule tape I'd bought at a supply house that sold to electricians. I stripped 7 layers of lead paint from the staircase balusters with an infrared speed heater, the paint lifting in bubbling sheets, and I refinished them with amber shellac that glowed like honey. Every evening I retreated into the turret, a room so saturated with Martin's presence that I could still smell the faint ghost of his drafting graphite in the air. The book sat in precise Dewey Decimal order, his annotations in blue fountain pen in the margins of Jane Eyre and David Copperfield, notes about architectural light and proportion that connected fiction to the built world. It was sanctuary in 3 dimensions, and I believed Lauren understood that. She married Derek the 3rd year, a man who wore pocket squares that matched his socks and spent dinners explaining revenue per available room, as if a bed were a stock ticker. I chose to see ambition, not avarice. In the autumn of year 5, a man from Tavistock Heritage, a chain of high-end historic inns, knocked on our wraparound porch with a cash offer of $830,000. He wrote the figure on the back of his card in fountain pen and underlined it twice, the ink bleeding slightly into the cotton fiber. I said no before he had capped the pen. This house held Martin's handwriting in the margins, the thrum of the oil furnace I had restored myself, the smell of tung oil and old paper. Lauren said nothing at dinner that night, but her silence had a specific gravity I should have measured, like the specific gravity of urine in a dehydrated patient, a number I could have read if I had only dipped the strip. 6 weeks later, a certified mail packet from Morrison Title and Escrow arrived, the kind that requires a signature, and hands you a green card to prove delivery. Inside was a quitclaim deed transferring my entire interest to Lauren, notarized with a stamp that bore an expiration date 6 months earlier than the one on her original log. My signature rode the block in a shakily practiced loop, and tucked into the envelope was a cashier's check for $5,000 with a sticky note. Moving expenses. Love, Lauren. The county assessor's website confirmed the sale had recorded that morning, the property now vested in Ashford Grove Holdings LLC, a Delaware shell company with a registered agent listed as a strip mall mailbox. I stood in the turret with the letter in my hand and counted my pulse at the carotid, a nurse's reflex, 68 beats per minute, sinus rhythm, no ectopy. My heart was fine. It was the architecture of my life that had collapsed. Within 20 hours, Lauren and Derek arrived to help me transition. They swept through my house with bankers' boxes and clipboard checklists, discussing senior downsizing strategies and memory care adjacency units as if I were a depreciating asset in a portfolio. I watched from my wingback chair, slumping a little, letting my voice go soft and unsure. I had spent decades studying the pharmacology of confusion. Faking cognitive fog was a simple matter of a low mumble and delayed word retrieval, the kind of presentation I had seen in 100 elderly patients whose families were already shopping for nursing homes. I noted that Lauren's silk blouse carried a smudge of printer toner on the cuff, black and slightly raised, the residue of a drum cartridge running low. Derek's phone never stopped buzzing, and each glance at the screen tightened a muscle at the back of his jaw like a bail bondsman watching a clerk. They were terrified something would unravel, and that observation was my first real weapon. Lauren reached into Martin's third bookshelf, the one he had devoted exclusively to Bronte first editions, and pulled down a lavender copy of Wuthering Heights, its spine foxed to a mothwing fragility. She flipped the front matter, sneered at the yellowing, and said, "This isn't worth the dust it collects. It's junk." She dropped it into the black trash bag labeled library sale. My stomach clenched because that book had been Martin's talisman. He had annotated every storm scene in blue fountain pen, drawing cross-references to architectural manuals about wind loads on moorland cottages. I waited until they had moved upstairs to inventory the baseboards, the sound of their footsteps receding into the master suite, and I fished the book from the trash. The moment I lifted it, the weight was wrong, buoyant at the center, not the dense heft of 700 pages. I opened it. The text block had been excised with surgical precision. A rectangular cavity, 4 inches by 2, had been cut through the first 200 pages, the edges sanded smooth and lined with acid-free paper the color of weak tea. Martin had hollowed it himself, I knew, with an X-Acto knife and a straight edge, and the kind of obsessive patience that made him spend 6 weekends aligning a single porch joist. I could see the faint pencil guidelines he had drawn on the paste down in paper, still visible at the corners. Inside, folded to the size of a playing card, was the original partnership agreement, the one with Lauren's genuine signature, the county recorder's embossed seal, and the notarial certificate that matched her active commission log. Beneath it lay a 3x5 index card in Martin's handwriting. It read, "Do not trust her. Save yourself." The ink was the same blue he had used in the Wuthering Heights margins, and the card still smelled faintly of his study, of pipe tobacco and drafting paper, and a certain brand of gum arabic he used to fix his watercolors. I sat on the turret floor, my back against the cool, curved plaster, the stained glass casting a red lozenge across my lap, and allowed 30 seconds of tears. Then I dried my face with the inside of my cardigan, hid the hollowed book in the false bottom of my suitcase I had built from a scrap of Luan plywood and some Velcro, and I began to build a plan the way I built a care pathway for a septic patient. Airway, breathing, circulation, then everything else ordered by lethality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the people who smile at you over Sunday roast are sometimes the same ones picking the lock on your life while you pour the gravy. Because that is precisely what Lauren was doing, and I was about to pick a few locks of my own. That evening they convened a family meeting in my own den. Lauren handed me a document titled Release of Homestead Rights and Settlement of All Claims, 5 pages of tight legalese that I recognized as her own drafting. The core clause stated that I acknowledged the validity of the quitclaim, waived all future claims, and released Lauren and any assignees from liability in exchange for an additional $25,000, payable directly to an approved senior living facility. She even had a glossy brochure for Whispering Pines Senior Residences, a beige-on-beige facility where the dining room photos showed pureed food and bingo cards, and the copy on the back promised round-the-clock attentive staff, with a stark photo of a nurse whose smile never reached her eyes. I held the pen they gave me, a cheap ballpoint with a rubberized grip, and let my hand tremble, a fine motor tremor I had practiced in a mirror for 2 days by holding my arm at a precise 45-degree angle and tensing the forearm extensors in rapid flutters. "Laurie, honey, the print is all fuzzy," I said, pushing the words through a slight slur, letting my voice soften at the edges like a radio station fading out. "Can I sleep on it tonight?" She and Derek exchanged a glance, that micro twitch of irritation I had seen when she was 14 and asked to load the dishwasher, and then she smiled with all the sincerity of a settlement agent at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday. "Of course, Mom. Take your time, we just want you safe." I nodded, tucked the release into my cardigan pocket, and filed away the routing number I had already spotted on a bank statement half hidden under a stack of their moving blankets. The next morning they moved me into their home, a McMansion in Saddlebrook, estates where every mailbox was the identical shade of sage regulated by covenant, and every garage had 3 bays. My assigned suite was a basement guest room with a single high transom window too small for a cat to squeeze through, a deadbolt on the outside of the door they said was a safety feature for memory care, and a smoke detector whose green light blinked all night like a surgeon's pulse oximeter. I catalogued everything: the acoustic footprint of the central air vents, the frequency of the floorboard creaks over the den, the model number of the HP Office jet printer they used for loan documents, the exact brand of the deadbolt, a Schlage B60N that I could pick in under 30 seconds if I ever needed to prove a point, but chose not to. I walked slowly, left my reading glasses conspicuously on the kitchen counter, and feigned afternoon naps while I was actually building a mental map of their vulnerabilities, tracking the times they left the house, the codes they tapped into their alarm system, the password they used for the Wi-Fi that I saw on a sticky note stuck to the router. The real intelligence gathering began at 2 a.m., the third night, when I heard Lauren pacing in the den directly above my bed. I had already removed the basement vent grill, a cheap stamped aluminum louver held in place by 2 friction clips, and placed my ear against the ductwork, an old nurse's trick for monitoring a patient's room from the hallway. The metal carried her voice tinny but clear, and I could hear the rapid clicking of a laptop trackpad and the occasional thud of what sounded like a fist on a desk. "Notary audit," she was saying, her voice tight. "My commission isn't coming up in the active database. They are pulling the journal. Morrison is doing a full audit of every notarized document I filed in the last 18 months, and if they see the quitclaim, it's over." Derek's voice, a low rumble I couldn't fully parse, asked something about the loan. "We have until the 27th to close," she snapped. "Meridian Capital doesn't care about audits, they care about their balloon payment. We missed the last one because we had to pay off the boat note, and now they are calling the note a commission lapse." I had already checked the state's notary public roster on my prepaid burner phone, bought with cash at a gas station an hour away. Her name was not there. The stamp she had used on the forged quitclaim had been issued under a commission expired 6 months before the notarization date, rendering the instrument legally voidable under state law. Now Morrison Title's internal compliance audit was circling, and the Meridian Capital bridge loan, a hard money obligation with a 30-day term and 24% interest, was coming due. That explained the toner smudge, the jaw twitch, the frantic phone calls. I lay in the dark and smiled like a practitioner who had just identified the pathogen, knowing that the culture was already growing on the agar. The next afternoon, Derek attempted to fix a drip under the kitchen sink. I watched from the breakfast nook as he sprawled on the floor with a crescent wrench and a YouTube tutorial titled P-Trap Replacement for Beginners, his phone propped against a can of tomato soup. Within 4 minutes, the cabinet was gushing into the baseboard, water spreading across the tile grout in a widening delta. I walked over, shut the angle stops behind the sink with a quarter turn each, the chromed brass handles cold against my fingers, and loosened the compression nuts by hand. The nylon gasket had been over-tightened until it split, a common mistake from someone who thought brute force was a substitute for feel. I pulled a spare 1.5-inch gasket from my apron pocket, a leftover from the dozen sinks I had redone in the Victorian, applied a thin smear of silicone grease from a tiny tub I always carried, and seated it properly, the bevel facing the trap arm. I reassembled the trap, tightened by feel to just past hand tight, and turned the water back on. No drip. The whole operation took under 2 minutes. Derek stared at my hands as if they had performed a bypass graft. I said, "Old house tricks. Martin taught me." The truth was, Martin had never touched a pipe in his life. I had learned everything by tearing apart the Linden Street house, an entire body of trade skills that now served as a perfect camouflage. They saw a handy old widow. I saw a covert operative with a set of lock picks in her toiletry bag, and a thorough understanding of how to open a HON filing cabinet without leaving a trace. That night, long after the central air had cycled into its deep-hour hum, I went to work on the filing cabinet. I had scouted it during the daytime, naps, noting its placement against the west wall of the den, its brand and model number stamped on the back of the top drawer, a HON 4-drawer vertical beige with a cheap slide button wafer lock, the exact model I had seen in a dozen office supply clearance aisles. The lock uses 5 spring-loaded wafers, no sidebar, no false gates. A child could rake it if they knew the principle. I had practiced on an identical core I had salvaged from the Victorian's old apothecary cabinet and stashed in my suitcase, learning the binding order of the wafers by feel. I knelt in front of the cabinet at 2:17 a.m., the carpet absorbing my weight, my knees cushioned by a folded hand towel I had taken from the guest bathroom to avoid leaving carpet indentations. I removed 2 bobby pins from my hair, straightened one into a tension wrench with the rubber tip still on one end for grip, and inserted it into the bottom of the keyway. I applied light clockwise rotational pressure, just enough to bind the first wafer stack, feeling the slight resistance through my fingertips. With the second pin, bent into a shallow rake with a 20-degree angle at the tip, I stroked across the wafers 3 times, hearing and feeling the tick-tick-tick as each stack set above the shear line. The plug rotated with a soft, definitive click. I paused for 30 full seconds, listening for footsteps, the central air's compressor cycling on, the distant tick of a clock. Then I eased the drawer open. The first hanging folder, labeled Ashford Grove Settlement, contained a copy of the forged quitclaim with a post-it note in Derek's handwriting that read, "Need Mom's sig on final release before Tavi funds escrow." Behind it were 3 pages of printer paper where Lauren had traced my signature over 50 times, the loops and descenders gradually morphing from clumsy to smooth, the ink pressure shifting as her confidence grew. I could see where she had pressed harder on the downstroke of the capital M, exactly as I did, a habit she must have studied from old birthday cards. There was a promissory note from Meridian Capital, a hard money lender known for 30-day terms and 24% interest, with my name forged on the borrower line, pledging my 50% equity as collateral for a bridge loan of $260,000. The note listed the loan origination fee at 8 points, the default rate at 36%, and a balloon payment due in full in 30 days. I photographed every page with my burner phone, flash suppressed against my palm, the shutter click muted by a piece of electrical tape I had placed over the speaker. Bank statements in the same folder showed the loan proceeds had gone to pay off $28,000 in credit card debt spread across 4 cards, cover a down payment on a 38-foot Sea Ray boat with twin Mercury engines, and service the balloon mortgage on this very McMansion, which was apparently 2 payments behind. They had been insolvent for years, and my house was their liquidity event. The bottom drawer held a USB thumb drive, silver and unlabeled, taped to a folder called Morrison Notary Logs Backup. I knew I could not take it without alerting them, so I pulled out an OTG adapter I had bought at the same gas station, a tiny aluminum cylinder with a micro USB plug on one end and a full-size USB port on the other, and plugged the drive directly into my burner phone. The drive mounted in 15 seconds, and my file manager displayed a directory stuffed with scanned notary journals, PDFs of the fake quitclaim, email chains between Lauren, and a title closer discussing how to backdate the commission stamp identification to match the audit window if they ask. One email referenced a specific date stamp they planned to use, a self-inking trawler that could be adjusted, and I memorized the model number. I copied the entire contents, 3.4 gigabytes, onto my phone's encrypted internal storage, the transfer progress bar inching across the screen as my heart rate remained steady at 62. Then I powered down the adapter, replaced the thumb drive exactly as I had found it, the tape resealed, and relocked the cabinet using the tension wrench in reverse rotation until the plug snapped back to its locked position. Before closing the drawer, I laid a single strand of my hair, pale brown and nearly invisible, across the top edge of the drawer face where any opening would displace it. By 2:40 a.m., I was back in my basement bed, the digital copies already uploading to a cloud account under a pseudonym, the hair strand undisturbed when I checked at dawn. The next piece of the puzzle required a trip to the county recorder's office. Before I had allowed them to move me, I had scheduled a doctor's appointment at a clinic across town, and instead taken a bus downtown to the Hall of Records, a granite building that smelled of old paper and ammonia from the microfilm cleaning solutions. I requested the complete chain of title for the Linden Street property, parcel number 17-44209, read off a tax bill I had hidden in my bra. The clerk, a young man with librarian glasses and a quiet precision, pulled a microfilm roll from the climate-controlled stacks and threaded it into a digital scanner, printing 23 pages of recorded instruments on warm paper that curled at the edges. I sat at a laminate table in the reading room, the afternoon light angling through tall arched windows, and read everyone, line by line. There, recorded 3 days after the original partnership agreement, buried between a utility easement for the gas company and a boundary survey from 1912, was a document titled Consent and Covenant to Require Biometric Verification for Any Conveyance. It was 3 paragraphs of dense legal language, drafted, I recognized from the syntax, by Martin himself in consultation with a real estate attorney he had found through the Architectural Contract Guild. The covenant stated that any future deed of transfer, warranty, quitclaim or otherwise, would be void ab initio unless both named owners appeared personally at the office of the original title company, Morrison Title and Escrow, and provided a live ink thumbprint on the deed and on a separate affidavit of voluntary consent. The thumbprint had to be taken on an FBI-approved FD 258 fingerprint card, witnessed by a notary other than the one on the deed, and the notary had to certify under penalty of perjury that the print was given freely. Because the covenant was recorded in the chain of title, it ran with the land, binding any subsequent buyer regardless of notice. No thumbprint, no valid sale. My husband, the quiet architect, had read about a widow in Ohio who had been swindled by a forged quitclaim, and he had decided the only lock that could not be picked was a biometric one. He had never told me, never hinted, but he had built the emergency exit into the foundation, and the key was my own living skin. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted MS Okonkwo, the bank compliance officer whose name I had found on a red flag notice inside the Ashford Grove file. The notice, a 1-page internal memo from Andover Federal, had cited suspected elder financial exploitation and referred the matter to the compliance unit for a freeze on escrow disbursement. I called her from a public library study carrel, identifying myself as the true owner of the property, and offered to meet. We sat in her glass-walled conference room at Andover Federal later that week, the table a polished slab of walnut, the air cool and quiet. I laid the hollowed book, the original agreement, and my printed copies of the recorder's documents on the table. I explained the forged signature, the lapsed notary commission, the practice sheets, the loan documents, the thumb drive contents. She examined the covenant, tracing the recorder's stamp with her finger, and her expression shifted from professional neutrality to something cold and purposeful. Mr. Whitmore was a genius, she said. The sale to Ashford Grove is voidable ab initio because the biometric condition precedent was never satisfied. No thumbprint, no transfer of title, period. The escrow funds are already frozen pending our investigation. The funds are sitting in a segregated account and cannot move an inch without a court order. What we need now is to let them walk you into the title office and attempt to compel a fraudulent release, because that act crosses from civil forgery into criminal attempted theft by deception, a second-degree felony under the state's elder fraud statute. Are you willing to participate in a controlled operation? I said yes without hesitation. She gave me the contact for Sergeant Rowlands, a white-collar crimes detective who had been building a case on notary fraud rings in the county. I called him from the library, my voice low but steady, and by the end of the day we had a staged appointment and a recording device small enough to hide in the hollowed book, a wireless transmitter that fed directly to a surveillance van. But before the sting, I needed to know the absolute depth of my daughter's rot. I needed to extinguish the last pilot light of maternal mercy so I could watch her collapse without flinching. I called it the maximum cruelty beat, and I staged it on a grey Tuesday when the only light came from the kitchen fluorescents. I had been a cardiac ICU nurse for 2 decades. I knew exactly how to induce a syncopal episode that looked catastrophic, but was entirely transient. I sealed myself in the basement bathroom, lowered my head between my knees, and hyperventilated for 90 seconds, driving my arterial carbon dioxide down from a normal 40 millimeters of mercury to something in the low 20s, a state of acute respiratory alkalosis. Cerebral vasoconstriction followed as the blood vessels in my brain narrowed in response to the pH shift, sparking a dizzy, pre-syncopal haze, a grey fog at the edges of my vision that I recognized from countless patients who had rung their call lights seconds before passing out. I waited until the room spun gently, then I walked upstairs, gripping the handrail only lightly, and made it to the kitchen island. I let the spell take me. I collapsed onto the tile floor with a sound like a bag of laundry. My arm twisted under my body at an angle that looked unnatural but protected my shoulder, my eyes half open and unfocused, my breathing deliberately shallow at 6 breaths per minute, with a faint expiratory wheeze I had learned to imitate from listening to 100 patients with partial airway obstruction. I had positioned a manila folder labeled Lien Release Authorization on the counter, printed in Comic Sans, a font I knew Lauren considered beneath contempt, to test whether she would even notice the trap. And I waited, my pulse thready under my own fingers where I rested them on my wrist, 64 and regular. Lauren's beige suede flat stopped 6 inches from my outstretched hand. The soles made a soft scuff on the tile, and she did not kneel. "Mom," she said, not with concern but the distracted tone of someone searching for a misplaced stapler. "Derek, she's down." Footsteps heavier than a pause. No one checked my pulse. No one knelt to open my airway. No one dialed 911. Instead, my daughter stepped over my body, one foot placed carefully past my torso as if I were a puddle on a subway platform, the toe of her flat narrowly missing my ribcage, and walked to the counter. I heard the manila folder slide open, the pages rustle, and then Derek's voice, thin and nervous. "Is she even breathing?" And Lauren, calm as a pharmacist counting pills, said, "If she stops, it's not a problem. We just need her thumbprint before rigor sets in." "The ink pad still works on dead skin," I checked. "It absorbs the oils just fine up to about 4 hours post-mortem. After that we would need a glycerin-based ink, but I bought a standard pad so we have to move fast if she codes now." Dead skin. I catalogued the phrase along with her inflection, the slight emphasis on still works, the absence of any tremor, the clinical precision of her timeline. She had researched it. She had planned for the possibility of my death, and the only variable that concerned her was the ink's absorption rate. I waited 2 minutes, letting the full weight of her words settle into me like a cold bolus of Roman IV fluid. Then I inhaled sharply, blinked and groaned. What happened? Her transformation was instantaneous, a mask switching from contempt to comfort, her voice dropping into a practice coo. She knelt at last, cradled my head and said, "You fainted, Mom. Let's get you to bed." I let them help me to my feet and shuffled away. But inside, the last tie was severed, clean and cauterized. There is no bridge back from the phrase "works on dead skin." The confrontation came 3 days later. On a morning, Lauren told me we were going to Morrison Title to finalize the sale paperwork so you don't have to worry about anything. She had left a thumbprint card and an ink pad on my nightstand, the pad a standard black fingerprint ink from Searchy, with written instructions to practice pressing straight down without smudging, roll from nail to nail. I smiled and said I would give it my best effort. I dressed in a navy blouse and pressed slacks, the blouse chosen because its breast pocket perfectly held the small recording transmitter disguised as a button, and I tucked the Harlowed book into my purse because I wanted it on the conference table when the walls closed in on her. Morrison Title's office was a beige suite on the 4th floor of a suburban glass box, the elevator chime a pleasant 2-tone note. The conference room had a long mahogany table, a view of the parking lot through vertical blinds, and a young title clerk named Jenna who had been briefed by Sergeant Rowlands and whose hands trembled slightly as she arranged the paperwork. Lauren and Derek led me to the head of the table like a prisoner to the dock, their hands on my elbows, steering with a gentle pressure that was not gentle at all. Lauren slid a single-page document in front of me, titled Consent to Satisfy Recorded Covenant and Release of Thumbprint, freshly drafted because the original sale had been void without my biometric compliance. The document stated I voluntarily released the covenant's thumbprint requirement and agreed to be fingerprinted on the spot for the final deed. In other words, they needed my willing cooperation to fix their involuntary crime. Next to it, Jenna placed a compact fingerprint scanner, a cross-match Guardian model, its glass surface gleaming under the fluorescent light, a thin red LED line glowing ready. Lauren pressed a pen into my hand, a rollerball with permanent black ink. "Just sign, Mom. It's straightforward. You just need to press your thumb on the glass right after, then we can all go home and you can relax." Her voice dripped with that artificial sweetener, but I could see a tiny muscle in her eyelid twitch, a fasciculation born of stress and caffeine, and the knowledge that her entire financial house of cards rested on this moment. Derek's phone was already buzzing, and his foot tapped a staccato rhythm under the table, the vibration traveling through the carpet to my shoe. I examined the pen nib, the document's notarization block, the small box where a notary would stamp and sign, and then I set the pen down. I spoke clearly, a nurse's authoritative tone honed by 1,000 code blues, the volume pitched to carry to the hidden microphone in my blouse. You can forge a quitclaim deed, Lauren. You can trace my signature 50 times on practice paper while I am sleeping down the hall. You can steal a notary stamp from a lapsed commission and backdate the journal entry. You can step over my unconscious body on the kitchen floor and talk about thumbprinting my corpse. But you cannot forge a conscience, and you certainly cannot forge my thumbprint. Lauren's face cycled like a slot machine, confusion, fury, and then a pale, sweat-beaded terror that drained the color from her cheeks. She lunged for the original agreement that I had placed next to the hollow book, her hand outstretched, but Sergeant Rowlands was already standing from the corner where he had been pretending to review a bank statement. He held up his badge and said, "Lauren Whitfield, Derek Whitfield, you are under arrest for attempted grand theft by deception, forgery, and aggravated elder fraud. Place your hands on the table, palms down." The door opened, and 2 uniformed deputies stepped inside, their belts creaking. Derek attempted to bolt, ducking toward the door, but he made it 2 steps before a deputy hooked his arm and pivoted him into the wall with a controlled thump. I remained seated, the Harlow book open in front of me, the index card with Martin's warning clearly visible. I said, "My husband left me a note." It only took 1 chapter to understand it. The aftermath was a cascade of consequences I tracked with the same methodical diligence I once used for post-op vitals, a flowsheet in my mind where each box was checked in sequence. Lauren was charged with 2 counts of second-degree forgery, 1 count of attempted grand theft, and 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Derek faced accessory charges and a separate indictment for bank fraud on the Meridian Capital bridge loan, because the loan application had falsified my income and assets. The thumb drive I had copied combined with my photographs, the original agreement, the county recorder's covenant, and the recording from the sting, left their defense with no plausible argument. The prosecutor, a stern woman with a pinned brooch, told me the case was a slam dunk and a half. Lauren accepted a plea deal, guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted grand theft. She was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, 1,200 hours of community service, full restitution to me for the fraudulent loan amount plus damages, and a permanent revocation of her notary commission. But the most essential condition, the one I negotiated through the victim impact statement where I read Martin's note aloud to the courtroom, was that she maintain lawful, verifiable employment at a position I would provide. Within 60 days, a judge vacated the quitclaim deed ab initio, the order stating that the conveyance was void from its inception due to fraud and failure of the biometric condition precedent. The property reverted to me, free of any cloud. Tavistock Heritage offered $900,000 this time, their representative slightly more humble, but I had a better vision. I spent 3 months converting the Victorian into a licensed bed and breakfast with 7 guest rooms, each named after a Bronte or Dickens novel. The Jane Eyre loft with its window seat, the Great Expectations suite with a canopied bed, the Heathcliff's Moor room in charcoal and heather tones, and 4 others that readers of Victorian literature would recognise. The turret remained my private library, not open to guests, although you can see the stained glass glow from the staircase landing, the colours shifting with the time of day. I hired a petite kitchen crew, a grounds manager and a housekeeping team. For the laundry and housekeeping lead, I had a very specific candidate in mind. As part of her probation, Lauren needed work. I offered her the position, 40 hours a week, at a wage $1 above the county minimum, satisfying the court's employment mandate. I designed the uniform myself, a navy shift dress with a Peter Pan collar, a white apron tied at the waist, and a front pocket embroidered with the business logo, a stylized turret with a zigzag crack running through it, and beneath it the phrase "Pressed out my trust" in serif lettering, the thread I had custom dyed to match the exact cadmium red of the turret's central stained glass panel. Her name tag reads Lauren, but the font is deliberately squeezed, as if it is being erased, the kerning tight and the letters narrowing to thin strokes. Every morning she presses the percale sheets in a converted butler's pantry while tourists wander the hallways, admiring the wainscoting I refinished by hand, and the transom windows that still hold my linseed putty. The point-of-sale system in the breakfast room is programmed to print a prominent footer on every guest receipt, in 8-point courier, the font of court documents. Case No. 21 CF 0347 State v. Lauren Whitfield Forgery and Elder Fraud Turret of Betrayal B&B. Most guests never notice, but occasionally one does, and I give them the 2-minute version while they stir their coffee. It has become part of the inn's mystique, a story that circulates on travel blogs under headings like "The B&B where justice is pressed into the linens." Late evenings, I sit in the turret with the Harlowed copy of Wuthering Heights cradled in my lap, Martin's blue-inked marginalia fading under my fingers, as I trace his notes about moorland wind loads and the architecture of isolation. The note he left is still there, its message now more legacy than warning. He was right. Boundaries are a form of architecture, and I learned to build them with the same rigor he used on the porch joists, load calculated and never relying on the good faith of a single beam. Love without verification is an unrecorded deed, and no obligation is as crippling as a mortgage on a child's conscience that falls due all at once. I press my own thumbprint onto the glass of the turret window sometimes, just to feel the skin ridge against the cold, alive and voluntary, a biometric key to a life I rebuilt from the Harlow of a book. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe for more chronicles of quiet, procedural justice. This is the Turret Room signing off.